At about 1 in the afternoon on Easter Sunday, the 1st of April, 1945, two columns of dust appeared on the country roads east of a small German town called Lippstadt. From the south came a task force of the United States 3rd Armored Division, men of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges and his 1st Army, who had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on the 7th of March. From the north came a task force of the United States 2nd Armored Division, men of Lieutenant General William Simpson and his 9th Army, who had crossed the Rhine at Wesel on the 23rd of March. They met on the eastern fringe of Lippstadt, amid cheers and rough jokes and the rattle of idling engines, and at the moment they shook hands, they sealed the largest pocket of encircled enemy soldiers in the history of the United States Army. Inside that pocket were 317,000 German soldiers. Inside that pocket were around 24 generals and 1 admiral, Werner Scheer of Defense District 1 in Essen, and the headquarters of an entire army group. Inside that pocket were the cities of the Ruhr, Essen and Dortmund and Düsseldorf and Hagen, the steel and coal heart of the Reich, and 4 to 5 million civilians under the bombs. And at the center of it all, refusing to surrender, refusing even to consider surrender, was Field Marshal Walter Model. For Model, this was the end. For most of the men under his command, this was the beginning of something none of them had dared hope for in months. Because what closed around them at Lippstadt that Easter afternoon was not a Soviet pincer, it was an American one, and every German soldier with eyes still in his head and a brain still in his skull understood the difference, and understood that the difference was very probably the difference between dying and going home. Heeresgruppe B, Army Group B, had been one of the most powerful formations in the German order of battle. It had been formed in October 1939 for the campaign in the West. Under Walter Model, who took command in August 1944 after the Falaise disaster, it had absorbed the broken remnants of the Normandy front, rebuilt itself in a matter of weeks, and then thrown itself into the Ardennes counter-offensive in December 1944. The men who came out of the Ardennes and pulled back across the Rhine in February and March 1945 were the survivors of the Bulge. They were the panzer crews of the 5th Panzer Army under General Joseph Harp. They were the infantry of the 15th Army, under General Gustav Adolf von Zangen. They were 2 corps of the 1st Parachute Army. They were the rear echelon of Defense District 6, headquartered in Münster. They were old soldiers and young boys, paratroopers and flak crews and Luftwaffe ground personnel and Volkssturm men in their 50s and Hitler Youth conscripts. They were not what they had been in the spring of 1940, but they were still, on paper, an army group. In practice, by the 1st of April 1945, Model commanded a hollow shell. Of his perhaps 350,000 soldiers and rear area personnel, only about 75,000 carried infantry weapons. Another 75,000 had only pistols. He had food for 3 weeks if he stretched it, less if he had to feed civilians, which he did. He had ammunition for a few days of serious combat. He had almost no fuel. The Allied air forces owned the sky above the Ruhr, and had owned it for months. The factories that had once made his tanks and his shells lay in rubble, hammered by Royal Air Force night raids and United States Army Air Forces day raids, until the smokestacks were broken stumps and the rolling mills were twisted iron. But Model had something else, and it was the thing that would kill him. He had given his oath to Adolf Hitler. And Walter Model, the so-called Lion of Defense, the field marshal who had stabilized the Eastern Front 3 times when no one else could, did not break oaths. To understand why 317,000 of his men would, in the days that followed, walk out of the pocket with their hands over their heads and surrender to the Americans, you have to understand what was happening at the same moment, 700 kilometers to the east. Because the war on the Western Front in the spring of 1945 was not really a war about the Western Front. It was a race. It was a race between every German soldier who could still walk and the Red Army that was coming behind him, and the prize for winning the race was simply this: to die in bed, decades later, instead of dying in a hole in the snow somewhere east of the Volga, with a Russian guard and a Russian winter, and no one to remember your name. The race had been on since the 12th of January 1945. On that morning, Marshal Ivan Konev opened the Vistula-Oder offensive with an artillery barrage from the Baranov bridgehead in southern Poland that broke the German front in less than a day. 2 days later, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched his own offensive from the Magnushoe and Puławy bridgeheads. Within 2.5 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 500 kilometers. By the 31st of January, Zhukov's tanks stood on the Oder River, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. The German front in central Poland had not been pushed back. It had been erased. What followed was the largest mass migration in modern European history. 2.5 million civilians, most of them women and children and old men, fled westward out of East Prussia and Pomerania and Silesia in the dead of winter. They fled on foot in temperatures that touched -20 and -25 degrees Celsius. They fled in farm carts pulled by exhausted horses. They fled in boats and barges through the ice of the Baltic. They fled because of what they had heard about a place called Nemmersdorf. Nemmersdorf was a village in East Prussia. Soviet troops of the 2nd Battalion of the 25th Guards Tank Brigade entered it on the 21st of October 1944. They were driven out within hours by a German counterattack. When the Wehrmacht retook the village 2 days later, on the 23rd of October, the bodies were photographed, and the photographs were given to Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels did what Goebbels did. He printed them in the Völkischer Beobachter, ran them in the weekly newsreels, and embellished the details until the village became a synonym for terror. The bitter irony was that some of the embellishments were lies, but the underlying event was real. People had been killed at Nemmersdorf. The post-war historian Bernhard Fisch, who returned to the records and the witnesses, documented 23 civilian murders in the village itself and another 38 in nearby hamlets. Major General Erich Dethlefsen, the former Chief of Staff of the German Fourth Army, testified to a United States tribunal at Neu-Ulm on the 5th of July 1946 about what had been found. The Soviet writer Lev Kopelev, a political officer in the area at the time who later spent 10 years in the Gulag for his honesty about it, wrote about it in his memoirs. The poet Alexander Solzhenitsyn, an artillery captain in East Prussia in January 1945, wrote a long poem called Prussian Nights about what he saw there. So the rumors that reached the German frontline soldier in 1945 were rumors that contained truth. And the truth, by the time the Red Army was crossing the Oder in February, was a truth being lived by every German woman left in East Prussia and Silesia and Pomerania and eventually Berlin itself. The historian Antony Beevor, working in the Russian state archives, documented what was happening, what continued happening through the spring and summer of 1945, on a scale that has no real parallel in 20th century European history. The estimates are imprecise because no one was keeping records, but the academic range is between 1.4 million and 2 million German women raped by Red Army soldiers during the conquest and occupation. In Berlin alone, the hospitals of Charité and other facilities in the western districts logged between 95,000 and 130,000 cases. One Berlin physician estimated that approximately 10% of the victims died of suicide, of injury, of infection, of despair. The German soldier on the Oder, the German soldier in the Ruhr Pocket, the German soldier holed up in a farmhouse outside Kustrin, the German soldier of Walter Model's Army Group B watching American Sherman tanks roll past at Lippstadt knew this. Some of them knew it because their own sisters had written letters before the postal service collapsed. Some of them knew it because refugees passed through their lines telling stories. All of them knew it because the German rumour net, the so-called Mund propaganda, had been carrying the news westward for months. And all of them remembered Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the great precedent. On the 31st of January and the 2nd of February 1943, the encircled Sixth Army had surrendered. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers had been taken alive. Of those 91,000, by the time the last survivors came home a dozen years later, between 5,000 and 6,000 were left. The rest had died of typhus and dysentery and exposure and starvation in camps, stretching from the Volga to the Lena. Most had died in the first year. The arithmetic was savage and simple. If you went into Soviet captivity in the winter of 1942 and 43, your odds of survival were less than 7 in 100. It was Walter Model himself, before the disaster of the Ruhr, who had summed up the whole German officer corps view of what Paulus had done at Stalingrad. A field marshal, Model had said, does not become a prisoner. Such a thing is just not possible. This was the wider stage on which the Ruhr Pocket closed. It was a stage on which an entire nation was running west. The German 12th Army, under General Walther Wenck, scraped together from training divisions and Reich labor service men and Hitler Youth in the second week of April, was being asked by Hitler to relieve Berlin from the southwest. Wenck and his staff understood from the first map session that there would be no relief of Berlin. The mission, the real mission, was the Rettungswork, the rescue work, the operation to get civilians and soldiers across the Elbe alive. The German Ninth Army, under General Theodor Busse, encircled in the Spree forest east of Berlin, was preparing the breakout that would become the Battle of Elbe, in which 40,000 soldiers and civilians would die in the woods trying to reach Wenck's lines, and then the American lines beyond. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who would inherit the Reich on the 30th of April after Hitler's suicide, was already organizing what amounted to a state policy of westward flight. Every hour the Western Front held was an hour another column could march toward an American or a British prisoner of war cage. Every German bullet fired at General Eisenhower's armies was a bullet that bought time for the men running ahead of the Russians. This is the inversion that makes the closing weeks of the Second World War in Europe so strange and so revealing. The German army was not, by April 1945, fighting to win. It was not even fighting to lose with honor. It was fighting to lose to the right people. For the Wehrmacht private and the Wehrmacht officer alike, there was a calculation, and it was understood with the clarity of long thought. The best of all possible outcomes was surrender to the Americans. The Americans had supplies. The Americans fed their prisoners reliably. The Americans were governed by something the Germans had been hearing about for 4 years from Allied propaganda leaflets, the Geneva Convention of 1929, which Germany had ratified, and which the United States had ratified, and which guaranteed prisoners of war certain rights to food and medical care and protection from forced labor. The Americans, above all, had not been on the receiving end of what the Wehrmacht had done in the East. Their cities had not been put to the torch. Their women had not been raped on the steppe. Their soldiers had not been starved in barbed wire pens. The German preference for American captivity was therefore not a moral judgment about who was the better captor. It was a clear-sighted reading of the death rate gap that the Wehrmacht had itself helped to create. Beyond the Americans came the British. The British were also Geneva Convention adherents and also professional soldiers. But the British, the rumour went, sometimes handed people back. The Cossacks at Lienz in late May and early June 1945, the men of the Russian Liberation Army, the émigré White Russians who had served in German uniform, all of them had been handed over to Soviet custody by British units, carrying out the terms of the Yalta Agreement. The German soldier could not entirely tell, in April, whether this would happen to Wehrmacht Germans as well. In the event, it did not, in any significant numbers. But the perception in the spring of 45 was that the Americans were the safest harbour of all. After the British, the French. The French would put a prisoner to work, clearing rubble and lifting mines. The death rate in French custody, eventually about 21,000 out of 937,000, was higher than the American or British rate, but still survivable. And at the far end of the spectrum, separated by a chasm from everything above, was surrender to the Red Army. To go east meant the long marches that had killed most of the men of Stalingrad. It meant the timber camps of the Komi Republic and the coal mines of the Donbass and the rebuilding of cities the Germans themselves had destroyed. It meant a daily ration of bread and watered cabbage soup that ran somewhere between 600 and 1,200 calories on a labour ration, when a man digging in a coal mine needed 3,500. It meant typhus and frostbite, and the slow attrition of years. It meant, above all, an open-ended sentence. No one in Soviet custody in 1945 had any idea when, or whether, he would ever go home. For the men of Walter Model's Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket on the 1st of April 1945, the choice was therefore not really a choice at all. It was a deliverance. The American 12th Army Group of General Omar Bradley, the largest American field command in history at 1.3 million men, had simply driven up and offered them their lives. The pocket itself was an oval roughly 30 miles wide and 75 miles long. It enclosed about 5,800 square kilometers of what had once been the industrial heart of Western Europe. To the south ran the Sieg River, to the west the Rhine, to the north the Lippe. To the east, the new American line ran from Lippstadt up toward the approaches of Paderborn, marked by the wreckage of Major General Maurice Rose's command jeep. Rose, the commanding general of the United States 3rd Armored Division, had been killed near Paderborn on the 30th of March 1945, when his column ran into a heavy German tank of an SS Panzer Brigade in the dusk. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theatre. His task force was the one that would link up at Lippstadt 40 hours later, not at Paderborn itself, but on the country roads to its west. Inside the perimeter, the pocket reduction began on the 1st of April for the 9th Army from the north, and on the 4th of April for the 1st Army from the south. By the 14th of April, the two American armies had met in the middle of the pocket, at the Ruhr River, splitting Model's force in two. By the 16th of April, the bulk of his men were surrendering en masse. By the 18th of April, organized resistance had ended. Düsseldorf had been taken without a shot fired, after an attempted local uprising called Aktion Rheinland tried unsuccessfully to surrender the city to the Americans before the SS could destroy it. The former mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, had been assassinated on the 25th of March by an SS werewolf squad parachuted in for the purpose, as a warning of what happened to Germans who cooperated with the enemy. The warning, as the Ruhr surrender showed, had not worked. Walter Model, on the 15th of April, did something that no other German field marshal did in the entire war. He dissolved Heeresgruppe B by his own order. He released the youngest classes, the boys of the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth, and the oldest classes, the men over 50, and authorized the rest to discard their uniforms and go home. He could not bring himself to surrender, but he could release his men from their obligation to die for nothing. Joseph Goebbels, in Berlin, hearing of this on the 20th of April, denounced the field marshal publicly as a traitor and his army as the traitorous Ruhr army. In the days after dissolving his command, Walter Model spoke to his chief of staff, General Karl Wagner, in words that have come down to us through Wagner's post-war testimony. "What is left for a defeated general?" Model said. "In ancient times they took poison." He knew that the Soviets had filed an indictment against him as a war criminal, citing him in connection with the deaths of approximately 577,000 people in concentration camps in Latvia and the deportation of 175,000 others as slave laborers from his rear areas. On the 21st of April 1945, accompanied by a small entourage of staff officers, including his adjutant Colonel Theodor Pilling, Model walked into a wood between the towns of Lintorf and Wedau. Today, part of the city of Rettingen, he stepped a few paces away from his men and shot himself in the head with his service pistol. The officers with him buried him on the spot. In 1955, his remains were recovered by his son and reburied at the German military cemetery at Vossenack in the Hürtgen forest, where many of the Americans who had fought to put him in his Ruhr coffin also lay. The rest of his men lived. 317,000 of them, plus the trickle of additional captures over the following weeks that pushed the final tally higher still in some American unit accounts, walked into American captivity. They walked out of the bombed cities of the Ruhr in long columns, hands above their heads or empty at their sides, helmets sometimes still on, often discarded by the roadside. They walked into the temporary holding pens that the Americans had thrown up in farm fields and meadows. From there they were moved into the Rhine Wiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow Camps, and 19 great enclosures running along the western bank of the Rhine. The Rhine Wiesenlager were not a paradise. They were perhaps the worst single chapter in the American treatment of German prisoners during the Second World War, and the German memoirs of those who passed through them are bitter. The first weeks, in April and early May, were brutal. Men slept in holes, they dug themselves with helmets and mess tins because no tents had been issued. Water was rationed. Latrines were holes in the ground. Food rations sometimes fell to 1,200 or 1,500 calories a day. The American Surgeon General's office report eventually compared one of the enclosures to Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prisoner of war camp of the American Civil War. Camp Remagen had been designed for 100,000 and held 184,000. The infrastructure simply did not exist. But the Rhine-Wiesenlager did not become Andersonville. The catastrophe that the Germans feared, that perhaps a quarter or a half of them would die in American hands, did not happen. The careful work of the German historian Kurt Böhme, published in the Maschke Commission volume on German prisoners in American hands in 1973, established that of the roughly 1 to 1.9 million men who passed through the Rhine-Wiesenlager, the documented deaths fell between 3,000 and 10,000. Albert Cowdery, the American medical historian working with American records, set an upper bound on all German deaths in American hands across the entire European theatre of operations of about 56,000, an estimated maximum of roughly 1.1% of the more than 3.8 million Germans the Americans captured. Releases began within weeks. The Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm men were released first. Farmers were released to bring in the harvest. Miners were released to restart the coal mines. By the end of the summer of 1945, most of the camps had been emptied, or their occupants transferred to French custody for reconstruction labour. In 1989, a Canadian writer named James Bacque published a book called Other Losses, which claimed that between 800,000 and 1 million Germans had died in American and French custody in the chaos of 1945, and that the deaths had been deliberate Eisenhower policy. The academic refutation was overwhelming and immediate. Albert Cowdery, Rüdiger Overmans, Brian Loring-Viller, Stephen Ambrose, Günther Bischoff, the editors and contributors of the 1992 volume Eisenhower and the German Prisoners of War, demonstrated that Bacque had misread bookkeeping categories, that the so-called Other Losses column in American records was an accounting bucket for prisoners transferred to French custody and for Volkssturm boys released without formal discharge, and that no remotely such number of deaths could be reconciled with the post-war German missing persons registrations of 1947, 48, and 50. When the Soviet archives opened in 1992, they confirmed approximately 381,000 documented German prisoner of war deaths in Soviet camps, a figure that accounted for the population Bacque had assigned to the West. The missing million had not been buried by Eisenhower, it had been buried in the East. This is the central fact, and it is the fact that the German soldier of 1945 understood without needing books or archives or commissions. The Maschke Commission, the 22-volume official West German government investigation into the fate of German prisoners of war that ran from 1962 to 1974 under the historian Erich Maschke, calculated that of the approximately 3 million Germans captured by the Soviets, 1,094,000 died. Rüdiger Overmans, working with the records of the Wehrmachtauskunftsstelle, the German military records office that catalogued service personnel, found 363,000 confirmed deaths in Soviet custody and judged it entirely plausible, while not provable, that another 700,000 listed as missing had also died there. The death rate in Soviet captivity was somewhere between 30 and 36%. The death rate in American captivity was somewhere around 1%. The ratio was 30 to 1. The German soldier did not need to do the math precisely. He could see it in the faces of the men who had come out of Stalingrad alive. There were not many of them. The race westward in the final 2 weeks of April and the first week of May 1945 was therefore not a panic. It was a calculation. It was the most clear-eyed calculation an army has ever made under fire. The numbers tell the story. Approximately 1.8 million German soldiers ended the war as prisoners of the Western Allies, the great majority of them captured in the last fortnight, the largest mass surrender in European history. They came from every direction. They came in trickles of 2 and 3. They came in walking columns of 10,000. They came in the broken remnants of corps and divisions, with their staff officers still trying to maintain order on a march that no longer led anywhere except into the meadows of the Rhine. General Walther Wenck and the 12th Army did not relieve Berlin. Of course they did not. Wenck had known on the 22nd of April, when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel arrived at his command post and ordered him to attack toward the capital, that there would be no relief. What he did instead was something military historians have written about with a certain quiet admiration ever since. He used his army as a shield. He pushed his lines just close enough to the southwestern outskirts of Berlin to give General Theodor Busse's encircled 9th Army something to break out toward. And when Busse's survivors broke through the Soviet cordon at Elbe in the last days of April, Wenck folded his perimeter back toward the Elbe and shepherded them, and the civilians following, westward. The Battle of Elbe was the largest pure breakout battle of the European War. About 80,000 soldiers and 150,000 to 200,000 civilians attempted it, beginning on the 24th of April. They had to break through 3 Soviet defensive lines in dense pine forest. The fighting was hand-to-hand in places. Approximately 40,000 soldiers and civilians were killed in the woods, The mass grave at the Waldfriedhof Halbe, a quiet pine forest cemetery, established in 1951, contains approximately 24,000 of them, the largest single Second World War cemetery in Germany. About 25,000 to 30,000 made it through to Wenck's lines at Bielitz on the 1st of May. What happened next was the operation that more than any other single act marks the final week of the war. Wenck and Busse turned their combined force around and marched it west toward the Elbe at Tangermünde. The Tangermünde rail bridge had been partially destroyed. Across the river were the men of the United States 102nd Infantry Division of Major General Frank Keating of Simpson's Ninth Army. Between the 4th and the 7th of May, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 German soldiers and civilians crossed the partially demolished span and the makeshift rafts and the swimmers' lines into American captivity. They crossed under Soviet artillery fire from the eastern bank. They crossed knowing that whoever did not make it across by the time the Russians arrived would be going east instead of being free. Wenck himself crossed in the final wave, surrendered to American forces at Tangermünde, and spent the next 2 years in American custody. He was released in 1947. This was the pattern, multiplied across hundreds of crossing points along the Elbe and the Mulde and the demarcation lines that had been agreed at Yalta. General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg signed the partial surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark on the 4th of May at Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters on the Lüneburg Heath. General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at General Eisenhower's forward headquarters in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France. At 2:41 in the morning, on the 7th of May, 1945, the signing took place in a bare map room. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell-Smith signed for the Allied Expeditionary Force. Major General Ivan Suzloparov signed for the Soviet Union, conditionally and with permission to be revisited. Major General François Cévez signed for France. Jodl had fought hard at Reims for 2 specific concessions. First, a partial surrender on the Western Front only. This Eisenhower refused, threatening on the 6th of May to close the Western lines to fleeing Germans entirely if Jodl did not accept the full unconditional terms. Second, Jodl asked for and received a 48-hour delay between the signing of the document and the moment the ceasefire took effect. The ceasefire was set for 23:01 Central European Time on the 8th of May. Those 48 hours, ostensibly granted to allow for the transmission of orders to scattered German units, were not really about transmission, they were about miles. They were about how many more thousands of soldiers Wenck and Busse and the broken army group Vistula could push across the Elbe before the war was officially over. Jodl said, after he signed, a sentence that has been preserved by United Press International and that captured the situation with cold precision. He said, with this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands. In this war, which has lasted more than 5 years, both have achieved more and suffered more, perhaps, than any other people in the world. A second instrument of surrender was signed at the Soviet Military Administration headquarters in Karlshorst, in eastern Berlin, late on the evening of the 8th of May. With the documents formally bearing that date, even though the proceedings ran into the early hours of the 9th. In Moscow time, it was already past midnight. This is the reason that the Soviet Union and its successor states have always celebrated Victory Day on the 9th of May, while the West celebrates on the 8th. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed for the German Armed Forces High Command. General Admiral von Friedeberg signed for the Navy. General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf signed for the Luftwaffe. Marshal Georgy Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signed for the Western Allies. General Karl Spaatz of the United States Army Air Forces and General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny of France witnessed. By the time these signatures were dry, approximately 1.8 million German soldiers had reached American or British custody. Approximately 3 million had been taken by the Soviets, or would be in the days immediately following as Eastern Pockets surrendered. The final Eastern Pocket was Heeres Group Kurland, Army Group Kurland, cut off in western Latvia since October 1944. Its commander, General Oberst Karl Hilpert, received Dönitz's surrender order on the 7th of May. He laid down arms at 1400 on the 8th of May. About 180,000 to 203,000 Germans surrendered to Marshal Leonid Govorov's Leningrad front, including 42 generals. Among them was a young anti-tank gunner named Gottlob Biedermann, whose memoir In Deadly Combat would, decades later, become one of the most reliable first-hand accounts of what came next. Biedermann was held in Soviet camps for 10 years. He came home in 1955. The calculation that the German soldier had made in the spring proved to be nearly perfectly accurate. The Americans treated their prisoners according to a roughly Geneva Convention standard, with the lapse of the Disarmed Enemy Forces designation, which Eisenhower had requested from the Combined Chiefs of Staff on the 10th of March 1945 to handle a problem that had no precedent. By that point, American forces were facing the prospect of taking custody of perhaps 5 million surrendering Germans within weeks, in a country whose food infrastructure, transport network, and medical system had been comprehensively shattered. There was no honest way to feed 5 million prisoners at full Geneva ration when the German civilian population itself was facing famine. The Disarmed Enemy Forces category was a logistical compromise, not a malicious workaround. Disarmed enemy forces did not receive the full Geneva ration. They did receive shelter, basic medical care, and eventual release. Most of them were released within months. About 370,000 to 425,000 Germans were transported across the Atlantic to the continental United States and held in approximately 500 camps spread across 46 states. Texas alone held about 50,000 of them in 70 camps. The big camps included Camp Hearn and Camp Huntsville, and Fort Bliss in Texas, Camp Papago Park in Arizona, Camp Aliceville in Alabama, and Camp Trinidad in Colorado. The treatment of the prisoners shipped to the United States was, by historical standards, almost embarrassingly humane. They received the same rations as American soldiers under the Geneva Convention. They were paid 80 cents a day in canteen scrip for their labor on farms and in factories. They attended educational classes. They formed orchestras. They watched Hollywood films in camp theaters. A Gallup poll in November 1943 found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government rather than the German people for the war, and the camp policies reflected this distinction. The death rate of German prisoners in continental United States camps was extraordinarily low. Only about 56 deaths from non-natural causes are documented across the entire system. Of 2,222 escapes, all but 7 were eventually recaptured. The last fugitive, a man named Georg Gertner, surrendered to a television talk show in 1985 after 40 years on the run. The historian Arnold Kramer, who interviewed hundreds of these men for his book Nazi Prisoners of War in America, said he never met one who admitted to being a Nazi. The British treated their prisoners similarly. About 3,635,000 Germans passed through British custody. Documented deaths totaled approximately 1,254. The death rate was below 1%. Most British-held prisoners were not released until 1948, many working on British farms in the interim. The French held approximately 937,000 Germans, transferred from American and British custody for the work of clearing rubble and lifting mines. Approximately 21,000 died, a death rate of around 2.5%, higher than the American or British rate but still survivable. Most were released by 1948 or 49, and then there were the men in the East, the men who had not been able to get to the Elbe in time, the men who had been encircled in Kurland, or trapped in the Heiligenbeil pocket on the Frisches Haff, or captured in the streets of Berlin or in the rubble of Königsberg. There were approximately 3 million of them. Their fate was the fate the rest of the German army had spent the spring of 1945 trying so desperately to avoid. For the men who went into Soviet captivity in May 1945, the journey to the camps was a thing of small horrors. They were marched on foot, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, to railway concentration points. They were loaded into freight cars, 50 or 60 to a car, and sent east. The journeys took weeks. They ended in camps that stretched from the Western Soviet Union to the timber forests of Komi, to the coal mines of Karaganda, to the gold fields of Kolyma. The labor was heavy. The food was the standard Gulag ration, calibrated by the Soviet camp administration during the 1930s for the slow extraction of work from human bodies before they failed. Approximately 2 million were repatriated by the end of 1949. Approximately 85,000 were retained as so-called convicted war criminals, through the early 1950s. The last large group, somewhat over 9,600, was held until the autumn of 1955. Their release was a political event. In September 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer flew to Moscow on a state visit, the first West German leader to do so. He met with the Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin and with the Communist Party First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. He came with a single non-negotiable demand, that the last Germans must come home. The Soviets had a single non-negotiable demand of their own, that the Federal Republic of Germany establish full diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. On the 13th of September 1955, the deal was signed. The Spätheimkehrer, the late returnees, began to come home in October. The first trains arrived at the Friedland reception camp in Lower Saxony and at the Herleshausen border crossing in Hesse to scenes of weeping families and brass bands. The last group arrived at Herleshausen on the 14th of January 1956, 11 years after the war ended. They were photographed, stepping down from the trains in their padded camp jackets, gaunt and grey-haired before their time, looking around at a country most of them did not recognize. Some had wives who had remarried, believing them dead. Some had children who did not know them. Some had no one. The German Red Cross tracing service, even after the Spätheimkehrer came home, listed approximately 1.3 million German military personnel as still officially missing. Most, the historian Rüdiger Overmans concluded, after years in the archives, had died in the East between 1945 and 1950. The men who had made it to American captivity had, by the time the last trains rolled into Herleshausen, long since rebuilt their lives. The boys of the Volkssturm, released first from the Rheinweisenlager, were grandfathers. The veterans of the Bulge, who had walked into the Lippstadt cordon on Easter Sunday 1945, had pensions. Several thousand had even immigrated to the United States and made new lives in the same country whose army had taken them prisoner. The Maschke Commission, the West German government's official scholarly investigation into the fate of the German prisoners of war, finished its work in 1974. The commission ran 22 volumes. It was the most thorough study any nation has ever conducted of the fate of its captured soldiers. It found what the German soldier of April 1945 had already, in his bones, known. It found that of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Americans, 99 came home. It found that of every 100 captured by the British, 99 came home. It found that of every 100 captured by the French, 97 came home. And it found that of every 100 captured by the Soviets, only between 64 and 70 came home, depending on which set of figures one used. The men of the Ruhr Pocket did not know these numbers in April 1945. They could not have known them, but they knew enough. They knew Stalingrad. They knew Nemmersdorf. They knew what was happening to the women of East Prussia. They knew the saying, the bitter little saying that ran like a current through every German military unit in the last weeks of the war. Nur nicht in russischer Gefangenschaft, anything but Russian captivity. What had begun on Easter Sunday on the eastern fringe of Lippstadt at 1 in the afternoon, ended, in a sense, on the 14th of January 1956 at the Herleshausen border crossing. The two events, 11 years apart, are the bookends of the same story. It is the story of an army that lost a war but understood, in losing it, that even at the very end there were better and worse ways to lose. It is the story of 317,000 men who walked into the meadows of the Rhine and lived, while 3 million walked into the steppe, and a third of them did not. Walter Model, in the wood between Duisburg and Lintorf, made the opposite choice. He chose to die rather than to be a defeated general. He did this because he could not imagine living in the world that was about to be born, the world in which a German field marshal might be a defendant in a courtroom, or a witness at a tribunal, or simply a man trying to find an apartment in a ruined city. His soldiers, in their hundreds of thousands, made the choice he could not. They walked out of the pocket. They held up their hands. They went home, eventually, most of them. The ones who had not been at Lippstadt or Tangermünde or the Lüneburg Heath, the ones who had been at Königsberg or Halbe or Kurland, did not go home, most of them, for many years. Some did not go home at all. The lesson of the Ruhr Pocket and of the great westward race of April and May 1945 is not a lesson about heroism or about strategy or about the closing campaigns of the European war. The maps and the orders of battle and the unit citations all exist. The lesson is something stranger and more human than that. Soldiers in 1945 knew, with absolute precision, where it was safe to surrender and where it was not. They knew it because they had been on the other side of the wire themselves, in Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine. They knew what the Wehrmacht had done to Soviet prisoners. The historian Christian Streit, in his 1978 study Keine Kameraden, established that of approximately 5.7 million Soviet prisoners taken by the Germans, 3.3 million had died. The German soldier of 1945 did not need Streit's book to know this. He had worked the camp guards. He had seen the columns. He had counted the trenches. What he expected from the Russians was, in essence, what Germans had done to the Russians, and he was nearly right. The death rate that the Wehrmacht had inflicted on Soviet prisoners was approximately 58%. The death rate that the Soviets inflicted on German prisoners was approximately 35%. The proportion was different. The principle was not. What he did not expect, and what saved his life, was the Americans. The Americans were not, in 1945, a particularly forgiving country. They had lost more than 400,000 of their own soldiers in the war. They had liberated, in the same weeks that the Ruhr Pocket was being closed, the camps at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald and Dachau. The photographs from those camps had hardened American opinion. Eisenhower himself, after touring Ohrdruf on the 12th of April 1945, ordered every American unit not at the front to come and see, so that no one in the future could ever say it had not happened. The American soldier in April 1945 was a man with reasons to hate. But the American soldier was also, by training and by tradition, and by the simple structural fact of his army's command culture, a soldier of laws. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was law. The Articles of War were law. The standing orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were law. When a German soldier put his hands up, the American soldier was instructed to take him prisoner, to disarm him, to feed him, to get him to a holding pen. The instructions were not always followed perfectly. There were lapses. There were a small number of incidents at Dachau on the 29th of April 1945, in the immediate emotional aftermath of the discovery of stacked corpses and starving inmates, in which men of the 45th Infantry Division shot SS guards in violation of United States Army regulations. These incidents were investigated by the Inspector General of the 7th Army, the so-called Whittaker Report of the 8th of June 1945. But the system worked, on the whole, in the way the system was supposed to work. And so a German private, who put his hands up east of Lippstadt on the 3rd of April 1945, was in 9 cases out of 10, and in higher than 9 cases out of 10, going to live to see his children grow up. This is the inheritance of the great westward race. It is not a glorious one. There is no gallant last stand at the heart of it. There are no bands playing as the colours come down. The Wehrmacht did not surrender at the Ruhr, or at Tangermünde, or at Reims, with anything resembling honour in the old military sense. It surrendered the way a drowning man grabs at a rope. It surrendered to the only captor that would not kill it. The men who came home from American camps in 1946 and 47 did not, mostly, talk about it. They went to work. They rebuilt the cities they had defended. They voted for Konrad Adenauer, and they paid their taxes, and they sent their sons to a Bundeswehr that was specifically and deliberately designed to be different from the Wehrmacht. The men who came home from Soviet camps in 1955 and 56 often could not work, could not sleep through the night, could not stand in lines or sit in small rooms or hear a particular kind of accented German without flinching. Their stories were collected, slowly, by sociologists and historians and the Maschke Commission. Some wrote memoirs, most did not. The last of them died in the early years of the 21st century, taking what they had seen with them. The sites where it happened are quiet now. The eastern fringe of Lippstadt, where the columns met on Easter Sunday, is a country crossroads in the modern North Rhine-Westphalia, with a small marker. The wood between Lintorf and Wedau, where Walter Model put a pistol to his own head, is a piece of forest in Rattingen. The Tangermünde Bridge has been rebuilt across the Elbe. The Friedland reception camp in Lower Saxony, where the late returnees came home, is now a memorial site that handles new arrivals to the Federal Republic. The Waldfriedhof Halbe is a forest cemetery with a small visitors' centre and the names of approximately 24,000 German soldiers and civilians on stones beneath the pines. There is no single monument to what these men did, because what they did was not a battle, and they did not in any way the German military tradition recognized win anything. They survived. That was the whole achievement. They survived a war they had begun and lost by walking west instead of east when the choice was offered. The choice cost them their honor in the old style, the style of Walter Model. It saved them from sharing his grave. And it shows, perhaps more clearly than any other moment of the war, what soldiers actually do at the end, when the slogans are gone and the flags are down, and only the calculations of survival remain. They look at the captors arrayed against them, and they pick the one who will let them go home. The men of Walter Model's Army Group B picked the Americans. So did almost everyone else who could. The men who answered correctly came home.